Good day everyone, and welcome to the ILM Traceability in the Leather Supply Chain Part 2 webinar. My name is Martin Ricker and I am the Content Director of International Leather Maker. Following on from the first webinar on traceability in the leather supply chain we hosted in June 2017, we have returned to this important topic once again. Today we have three short but very interesting and topical presentations from three industry-leading experts in their field. All the presentations are very different from one another, but they all fit within the general theme of the webinar and cover some of the valuable work that the global leather industry is doing to ensure that it is as open and transparent as it can be. Among our audience today, we have attendees from throughout the leather supply chain with a range of knowledge and understanding of this topic. Our three presenters have tried to prepare their presentations to reach a broad range of listeners with varying levels of subject knowledge. The webinar today is organised by market-leading leather industry media provider, International Leather Maker, ILM, and is in association with the global online raw materials pricing analysis platform, thesourreport.com. I am also pleased to mention that the global leather chemical supplier Stahl and US-based meat and hide processor Tyson Foods are the co-sponsors of the webinar today. ILM could not offer these free events without their support. The SAR report has just updated its comprehensive online and in-depth report titled Traceability in the Leather Supply Chain. The report features 4 new chapters on the following topics related to transparency and traceability. There's a chapter on modern slavery, there's a chapter on beating counterfeiting and traceability, a new chapter on chemical traceability for compliance and transparency, and also there's a chapter on tracing cut automotive leather parts. This comprehensive online report is now available to purchase, covering 12 chapters of over 60 pages, featuring the most up-to-date information relating to traceability in the leather supply chain from the farm through to the finished leather product. The report is exclusively available on the SAR report website and covers the 7 drivers of traceability which have been identified in this and other reports from other industries, where the ability to track products transparently through the supply chain is required. The report looks at what traceability and tracking really means in a practical sense and explores the need for traceability in the first place. If you want to know more about this report, my email address is coming up at the end of this webinar, or you can simply visit the sourreport.com website. Just to run through today's webinar program, each of the 3 presenters will speak for approximately 10 minutes. The broadcast today is recorded, so we will send a link to all attendees as well as those that registered but could not attend. Our first speaker is Laura Wright, Director of Animal Wellbeing and Sustainability for Tyson Foods. Her presentation is titled Animal Wellbeing in the Beef Industry. Second presenter is Michael Costello, Director of Sustainability for Stahl, and his presentation titled Lifecycle Assessment Methodology Applied to Leather Manufacturing. And the third presentation is from John Grabin, Senior Director of Materials for Decker Brands, and his presentation is titled Building Consumer Trust Through Supply Chain Transparency. Before I introduce the first speaker, after the third presentation, we'll have a short question and answer session. On your screen, you should see a facility to send a question in the menu options. Please mention in your text which presenter you would like to respond to your question. If we do not answer your specific question today, I will forward it on to the relevant person or people by email for them to respond to you directly by email after the webinar. Now, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Laura Wright of Tyson Foods, who will present animal well-being in the beef industry.
Well, hello, thank you. I'm so excited to share with you today a little bit about animal well-being in the beef industry, and more specifically how Tyson has addressed the broader sustainability needs of many of our customers in regards to addressing those animal well-being and traceability concerns. So with that, I think it's important to first lay the foundation of animal well-being expectations. So Tyson, much like many other companies that utilize animal products in their production, they have adopted the 5 freedoms that are internationally recognized. Those are the freedom from hunger and thirst, the freedom from discomfort, pain, injury, or disease, as well as the freedom to express normal behavior and freedom from fear and distress. Now, how every company or facility addresses those may be different based on their geographic location or the actual animals that they're utilizing or environmental factors. But ultimately, I think it's important that they're grounded in these 5 freedoms that are internationally recognized. But really, there is a bigger animal well-being story to be told and to be shared than just those 5 freedoms. We live in a world of transparency and the desire for our customers to have personal, honest, and real information, and to be able to understand how their products they use in their everyday life are produced and cared for in regards to animal welfare, as well as other sustainability features. This is an infographic that came out this spring from the Hartman Group that I think really depicts the picture that often when consumers have an interest in animal welfare, that really is a first step for them to enter the world of sustainability and want to know more about other sustainable factors such as traceability or an environmental footprint. In fact, 71% of the consumers that were surveyed here say that when they make a purchase decision, it's important for them to know that the company is avoiding inhumane treatment of animals. So at Tyson, we have had an animal well-being program at our processing facilities for many, many years. And that starts with training of our employees that are handling the livestock. It also involves standard operating procedures through established and written programs in order to carry out and execute good care for the animals that we are utilizing and receiving. And then we also want to monitor both through internal audits as well as external third-party audits how we are meeting those expectations and carrying out our activities with the animals. And finally, we have dedicated staff, not only at a corporate level, but also at each individual plant that produces product. So this is an aerial view of one of our beef facilities, and I wanted to put that up in a way to display that customers for a long time were concerned with just the entry part of our plant in regards to animal welfare. They were concerned about when the animals were received and as they were handled throughout the leading up to the slaughter floor. We now have customers who are asking more and more questions about what's happening throughout our facility to our finished product, whether that is meat or the hides that we're utilizing in our tanneries as well. And not only moving forward in that production chain are we getting those questions, but we're also getting more and more questions from our supply chain before they even enter the gate at the plant establishment. Customers want to know more about how the livestock is transported carefully to our plant. They want to know how the animals are fed at a feed yard and identified throughout the system, as well as how can we get back to the ranch of origin and know where that animal came from, how it was cared for on the ranch. And so often you may wonder, what do consumers or customers really want to know? And so I believe this picture well illustrates that, for at least for me. It shows a mother with a young child that's peering over a sea of cattle at a large feed yard facility. You can see a feed mill on the horizon. But I want to draw your attention to that mother and child, and right next to them is a barbed wire fence. And so for me, it really paints the picture that she is intrigued and wants to know more. And even the cattle that are looking at her from across the way are interested in her as well, it appears. But honestly, she's looking for more information. And so it really is an opportunity for us to share and educate. One way that Tyson has been able to accomplish that is through our Farm Check program. We launched the Farm Check program in October of 2012, and it really is a way for us to ensure animal well-being at every step of production, not just at our processing facilities, but even before those cattle or hogs come to our plants. Not only is it an audit program on the farm, but it also is an external advisory panel because we know there's going to be better ways and we do not have all the answers. So we want to seek out those experts that can help us find those better ways. And it then leads into our research program where we will dedicate monies to research new technology or better ways to raise livestock. And then again, the internal staff that we have dedicated to animal well-being programs and execution at our plant. We do report transparently our farm check audit results through our sustainability report. This is the results that were shared in the 2017 sustainability report that just came out last month, in which it shows we've done over 500 third-party audits over a course of 5 years at Tyson. Moreover, we do show what those results are showing from those audits by species, and it does show that we are improving. And again, if you would like to see more information, the Tyson Sustainability Report is online and available for your review. Not only are we looking at our Tyson programs to help address our customer concerns on animal welfare and other sustainability detail, but we also seek out our industry partners and support industry endeavors in this area. One example is the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and their Beef Quality Assurance Program. The BQA program is a nationally coordinated and state implemented program platform for husbandry techniques, as well as best practices for record keeping and health procedures for the animals. It really does provide an opportunity to empower the producers to make a difference in what they do every day. Also provides a vehicle for us to explain to our consumers how our livestock producers are caring for the animals. It also provides an opportunity for us to share our story as livestock producers and processors. We're working together to produce safe and wholesome products for our customers. So where do we go from here? We know and understand that our customers want to know more. And so it really is, in my opinion, about telling our story, whether that is our processing plant, how we are producing the hides in our tanneries that goes on to our customers, or at the producer level and how those animals are traced back to the ranch of origin. That often results in the need for education and taking the time to explain why we do what we do, as well as looking and assessing our practices and making improvements where improvements need to be made. We'll continue to be responsible stewards of the animals that we have in our care and support those industry efforts like beef quality assurance. I think probably the most important thing to do is to keep an open mind. Keep an open mind to new technologies to raise livestock in a more humane fashion, or be able to trace our hides back to individual animals, for instance, and then ultimately the products that are produced from those. Keep an open mind about sharing our story with a customer or a consumer that may not know the intricacies of our programs and what we do in our industry. Ultimately, we're all here to find real solutions that are going to last and to sustain our industry. And the only way to do that is to be committed to continuous improvement. What we do today is certainly better than the way we did things yesterday, and how we do things tomorrow will be better than it is today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you, and now I will hand it over to Martin.
Thank you, Laura. That was a really interesting opening to the webinar today. Animal welfare really is a hot topic in the leather supply chain at the moment. Moving on to our second presentation, I'd like to introduce Michael Costello, Director of Sustainability for Stahl, who's going to present Lifecycle Assessment Methodology applied to leather manufacturing. Over to you, Mike.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Martin, for that introduction. So my talk today is about, indeed, life cycle assessment methodology, but in this case applied to leather manufacturing. I think this is a topic that has been in the news recently. In April, you may have seen some of the news articles about the product category rules that were approved, and this topic is related to that quite strongly. So I thought it would be good to try at least to clarify what LCA means for leather within these new rules. So what I thought I would begin with is a brief description of what LCA is, the methodology, terminology, what actually would be measured and reported in this case of the leather process, and the environmental impact data and categories. Now, the output of all of this assessment is an environmental product declaration, so we'll see that. We'll see an example of one of those for, in fact, a chemical. And not forgetting the most important development, I think, in this topic is the product category rules and boundaries, which have been defined now and approved. So we'll see an example of a chemical used in tanneries and finish off by summarizing the topic. So I'll talk for about 10 minutes. Okay, methodology and terminology. I think the good news is that there is a system now available to capture the environmental impact of leather. And life cycle analysis, by the way, is a technique that's used to assess the environmental impact associated with all stages of any product's life cycle, from the raw material extraction all the way through to the use of the product and indeed the repair and maintenance of that product. But what is new, I think, for leather is the product category rules, which have been defined and approved recently. So the life cycle analysis calculates the environmental impact within those rules and boundaries that have been defined. So the complete leather process is quantified in this way. And this is a cradle to gate approach, of course, not cradle to grave, since the cradle to gate goes from the extraction right through to the factory gate before it's shipped to the consumer. So those are the boundaries in this case, and we'll see that. So what is measured and reported? Well, the way it works is the life cycle inventory data is collected for the process, and we'll see what that means. It's basically a set of inputs and outputs. And then the core manufacturing emissions and let's say impacts are measured also. And when you combine those two, you can get environmental impact data, which can be calculated using special software, which is available. And I think the most important point to make here is that the results, although there's really huge numbers of data points here and very complex data, the results are reported in well-known environmental language. So this is language that the environmental community can understand, and in categories that the environmental community has agreed. So it's not leather language, it's environmental language. This is important. And the output is indeed what we call an EPD, an environmental product declaration, and we'll have a look at one of those. So what are these material flows involved in the life cycle inventory process? Because this is really about the consumption in your process, so the input consumption data. So there's databases available for all the chemicals going right back to their extraction from the earth, or if they're grown or whatever. And of course, the resources that are put into the process, which could be energy and water, for example. And then the output of the process is basically emissions, which could be gases, of course, but it's also waste products and effluent. So those are the basic material flows that need to be calculated in order to do the life cycle assessment. And if you look at the leather process, you can see in very simplistic form there what those inputs and outputs are for that process. The inputs, of course, are the hides and the chemicals, but also the energy and the water. And the outputs are the emissions into the air, solid waste, and of course, wastewater effluent, where we're so involved in that, of course. So that's the leather process. But if you drilled even deeper into the leather process, you can get a flavor of the kind of detail we're talking about here. If you just go into the beam house example, the input data would indeed be a list of all the chemicals that go in. Obviously, the rawhide is an input data, but if you just take the chemical side, so in each of those chemical groups, you'd have to drill down and get data from those chemicals right back to their extraction or their mining or whatever it is that it took to get them in the format that they're in now. So that's all the input data that would have to be calculated just for beam house. And then you have all the output data, of course, the blood, the hair, the proteins, fats. And of course, in the middle, you've got the actual core operation, which also needs to be calculated for the LCA. So this slide is just to give you a flavor of the kind of detail you have to go into to get a good flavor of this. But then, of course, all that data is quite complex and big. There's a lot of data there, you can imagine, for each of those inputs. So what happens now is that the production data is processed into life cycle assessment software, and that is converted into environmental impact data. So the environmental impact data is reported in the Environmental Product Declaration, the EPD. That conversion is again done by special software, which is available, of course. So that conversion puts the data that was very complex and really not usable into something that's usable, and it's categorized then into environmental impact categories. And this is where the language of the environmentalist comes into play, because these are terms and terminology that is understood by the global environmental movement. So we're converting really grainy, detailed data from the chemical or the leather process into something that's readable by a much wider community. I think that's really important here to understand that point. But before I get to an example, what's really key here is the product category rules, because this really is a major milestone which has taken place in April. It was confirmed. A major milestone in getting a harmonized methodology for the calculation of the environmental footprint of leather, because this is something that hasn't existed. And product category rules, which are sometimes called the PCR or the PEFCR, they represent the specific guidelines as applied to a narrow field of use, in this case, leather. And these product category rules were developed by and led by COTANS, with several other stakeholders involved, including ICT units, but also I think the Scottish Leather Group. The Secretariat was a long group of companies, and really they've done very well to get to this stage, led by COTANS, of course. And what the leather PCR does is it defines the system boundary. It defines the boundaries in which you can do your life cycle assessment. And that's really important, because that's the only way you can really compare with other life cycles, whether it's within the leather substrate or even others. But certainly within leather, you could compare different processes and different chemistry based on these rules and really get a grainy picture, a data-based picture of your process versus other processes. Yeah. So the boundaries in this case begin at farming and they end at the tannery discharge, and then you can see on the slide here what that actually means. The dotted lines represent the boundaries in this particular case for the leather product category rules. Now, there's been so much debate about the allocation of farming and slaughtering to the final leather that we won't get into that today. And COTANS and the industry has been fighting for zero allocation of that part of the process to the leather. But in the end, what we've ended up with is some allocation. And if you look at the pop-up slide I'm showing now, 12% of the impact of farming is allocated to livestock. And then 3.5% of the slaughter is allocated to the rawhide. And then what that means is that about 0.5% of the total animal life cycle is allocated to the rawhide, which arrives at the tannery. So, okay, it's a small allocation, but there is an allocation. It's not zero, but it's also not, several percent. So when the rawhide comes in, the input allocation is already defined for that rawhide. But what about if we went into the actual tanning part at the very end of the slide there and got into the chemicals input into the life cycle assessment? How would we calculate that? How does that look in an environmental product declaration? Well, again, just looking at the chemicals, you have to go back to the extraction of that chemical, whether it's a natural resource or a mining resource or whatever it was. Then the transportation of that and the processing of that resource, the distribution of the chemicals, the manufacturing, of course, of the chemicals, and all that implies, including energy and all the other inputs, and the manufacturing of the intermediates and the product, and then the shipment of that product to the tannery. So all of those need to be drilled down and calculated in order to get the input chemical data, which would then be added to the overall picture if you're calculating a life cycle analysis for leather. And this is what an EPD, an environmental product declaration for a chemical, would look like. And again, we're talking about just the chemical here, not its use in the leather process. We're just talking about the chemical, its resource extraction, and its manufacture, because the framework and the product category rules that have been approved and defined allow for valid comparisons to be made, and that's important. So as we move forward, we believe that new processes and chemistries will require LCA data in order to be validated. And certainly in order to be marketed, we may need to use this kind of data to show that one process or one piece of chemistry is more or whatever the impact on the environment can be actually expressed, based on data rather than based on rumor or opinion. And as tanners become modeled under this LCA modeling, which we hope would happen, of course, the impact analysis will improve. So like I said, this really is a major milestone in getting these rules approved by the Environmental Footprinting Steering Committee. And I believe it's a very positive step forward for the industry in order to make these real data-based comparisons within the leather industry. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand over again to Martin.
Thank you, Mike. Leather certainly does have a positive story to tell in terms of its life cycle. Mike will be joining us again at the end of the webinar for the Q&A session. I would now like to hand over the webinar to our third and final presenter, John Grabin from Deckers Outdoor Brands. John will outline what a brand such as Deckers has implemented into its supply chain to make it more transparent with the aim of building trust with the end consumer. I will now hand over the webinar to John.
Thank you, Martin. I divided this presentation in two parts. So the first one is a quick overview of the business case for building a transparent supply chain. The second are some practical steps on how to trace the source of all animal hides to its origin. And I hope that by the end of it, you will have a better understanding on why transparency is becoming so crucial for business and what can be done today to create a platform for tracing animal hides. Getting straight to the first part, consumers now want to know everything about a product. Everything. No longer can you slap a label on a product and expect it to fly off the shelves. Consumers want to know more than what's in your product. They want detailed insights regarding where you source your materials, how the product was made, and what values guided the production process. Consumers seek out this information in order to determine if a company is trustworthy. But here's the challenge. In the current state of supply chains, 79% of companies believe they have good visibility at the Tier 1 supplier level. This figure drops to 36% for Tier 2, and just 17% for Tier 3 and beyond. With this situation, the origin of raw material, the processing plants involved, and the chemistry used across the supply chain can vary drastically, and without any awareness of the brand selling the product to the consumer. Quite commonly, the only real obligation for a direct supplier is to meet the agreed product specifications and overall quality, contributing to the looseness in control over the raw material sources. Many companies still rely heavily on direct suppliers for this sub-tier information. So when you consider that, how a brand can honestly say that the product it sells was ethically and sustainably sourced if they have no way of telling where it actually came from? Nowadays, there's no way around it. If you want loyal customers, you need to build a transparent brand. And there are tangible benefits in having a transparent supply chain. Consider this. Investing in ethical materials may require more costs up front, but it can have a significant payoff. In the past, and encouraged by consumer research, some companies thought they could charge a premium for products that were made using more sustainable or ethically sourced materials. That's the wrong way to look at it. The real advantage is you get to maintain operating profit margins and are less likely to need to get into price wars with a cheaper and questionable competitor. In an overly commoditized product environment, ethical sourcing becomes a very strong point of differentiation, enabling companies to hold least price. On the other hand, if you don't have a strong position, people would eventually switch to a new brand in the pursuit of product transparency, or without that option, simply go for the lowest price alternative. Brand transparency has the power to produce lifelong customers. These days, there are a massive number of brands competing for consumers' attention. To determine which products are actually worth buying can be very challenging. When consumers find a brand they feel they can trust, they're likely to stick with that brand for the long term. And guess what? The best way to build consumers' trust is through brand transparency. It's a very simple formula. If you increase transparency, you will increase consumer trust. Storytelling and providing consumers concrete examples of business practices is important. Actually showing and talking about what you do is key to being transparent. But just making your policies available to the public is not enough. Policy is the way a company articulates motivation. Now, practice is the way you demonstrate your commitment. Practices are a reflection of the company's internal motivation. They are a demonstration of the company's values in action. And demonstrating shared values is the foundation for building trust. What leads me to the second part of this presentation. As an example of actually putting policies to practice, and with the intent to provide more transparency to Decker's material sources, in 2017, we mapped the source of all our animal hides and skins. What you see on this map are percentages for the total square footage of leather Decker sourced in 2017. And to be clear, this is based on the country where the animal was slaughtered and most probably raised, and not where the hides were processed or tanned. Obviously, this information just doesn't simply make itself available on demand. There's a reasonable amount of groundwork to get to this stage. And here's a basic list of what needs to be in place. First and foremost, it requires that the brand has a direct relationship with its Tier 2 vendors, and with that, a vendor database. Materials must be created in a database having a link to the appropriate vendor. Here's where you'll be capturing the actual raw material species and country of origin. This information is initially provided in good faith by the tanners. And just for that, and I can't emphasize this enough, it is fundamental to have a close relationship with the Tier 2 vendor. Once you have that, it becomes a matter of connecting the dots, creating bill of materials that are linked to the material database, and running annualized reports either based on forecast for projected scenarios or looking at year-end ordering book for reporting based on actual purchased volumes. At this point, the question becomes, how do we verify that? We know our suppliers really well. We know our materials really well, and we have no reasons to question the accuracy of the information provided. But the public doesn't know that. And for that reason, and to gain their trust, we must have the means to verify it. So the next thing we do is to cross-reference that information against the data reported at the raw material traceability session of the Leather Working Group protocol. Of course, you can only do that if the tanners you source your leathers from are certified by the protocol, and you're given access to their audit report. In our view, it is imperative that we work only with Leather Working Group certified tanneries. First of all, this guarantees that the information is going to be available. And secondly, that it is verified by a third party. As a reference, what you see on the screen is a snapshot of the traceability session of the Leather Working Group protocol. At this stage, we would expect all tanners to have the ability to trace their hides at the very least to the country of origin. Going forward, we are targeting to have all cattle hides and sheepskin traceable to the slaughterhouse. As much as we would love to be able to tell a farm-to-table story, we do not believe it is feasible. Simply considering the complexity of the trade, and most importantly, the fact that the leather is not the driving force in this economy. We have to realize leather is simply a byproduct of the food industry, and with that, we understand the responsibility to manage farms and feedlots should rest with the meat producers. Unless you're in the fur business, animals are not being killed for the value of their skins. So for this reason, there is no incentive for any farmer to accept demands directly from the leather industry. That's not saying that the leather side of the supply chain should simply ignore the situation. It must demand for meat producers to operate and manage their extended supply chains in an ethical and humane way. And to be fair, many of them already do. What's missing here is a way to verify that. So before I go, I like to leave you with an invitation. If this is something that interests you, I'll ask you to join me on a couple of groups working on possible solutions to this challenge. The first one is the Animal Welfare Group, a subgroup of the Leather Working Group. So far, this group had been working on creating animal welfare profiles for the top 20 leather-producing countries in the world. This is extremely important as we establish due diligence requirements that are unique to the situation of specific country of origin. To give you an example, we prohibit the source of sheepskins from countries in the Middle East and North Africa. These are knowingly involved in the transport of live animals overseas, a practice condemned by our animal welfare policy. The second initiative I recommend is called Responsible Leather Roundtable, facilitated by the Textile Exchange. This group's effort seems to be moving in the direction to creating a verification tool to assess the practices of everyone involved in the production of leather, and that's starting at the farm. As we manage to trace the source of our hides and skins to the meat producer, we need to be able to determine if they share our values in their operations. With sound animal husbandry, humane animal treatment, and slaughtering practices. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. That was very interesting. If anybody wanted to contact John for any of those leather working group or any of the other groups he mentioned in the last slide, I'd be very happy to forward on your details to John and put you in contact with him. Now we're going to move on to the question and answer session. I've got some questions here for each of our presenters. John, what do you think are the financial benefits or incentives of having a more transparent supply chain?
Yeah, as I tried to make it very clear during the presentation, in terms of financial, the real benefit is, in my view, you get to keep or maintain your profitability. You know, if you think about commoditized products and materials, it's really hard to compete on any or having any point of difference to compete. And then if you do have this transparency or a more ethical supply chain, you actually do have a point of differentiation, but that's not necessarily to be taken as you can charge a premium for your product. I think it protects you from having to enter into a price war with the cheapest price competitor. So that's what I think about the financial benefits, is you get to preserve your profit margins. And in terms of other benefits, it's really, you create a relationship with your customers when you provide them the transparency to your supply chain. And I think consumers are now expecting this. And with that, you build loyalty. So you end up having consumers that are loyal to a brand for the long term.
Okay, thank you. And how difficult was it to obtain information from your hide, skin and leather suppliers to allow you to sort of have transparency in your supply chain? Was it an easy process?
That was a fairly easy process, and I have to attribute that to the relationship that we have with our vendors. And I try to emphasize that also during the presentation. It is critical that brands and companies do build that close relationship with their tier 2 suppliers. You cannot just rely on your direct suppliers to get this type of information. It just won't happen. If you really want to get this detailed information on your raw material sources, you have to create and develop that relationship directly with your tier 2 suppliers. So since we had those relationships in place, for us, it was very, very easy. And the second part that made this process very simple was the fact that we already work only with Leather Working Group certified tanneries. So they're used to have to provide traceability information during the audit. So when you have those two pieces together, actually gathering the information is very simple.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Okay, now Laura, I realise that you're not a person that's actually from the leather industry or the hide sort of part of the business at Tyson, but I've got a couple of questions here for you. The first question is, do you think it'll ever be realistic, cost effective or practical to be able to source an individual hide or skin processed at one of your facilities back to the farm or feedlot, given the high volumes that are processed each day by Tyson?
That's a good question. And I would say there's always new technology that's becoming available to improve traceability at all stages of production. So at Tyson, we continue to work with our cattle suppliers, for example, to improve individual animal ID of the cattle that are coming to us and the traceability that's associated to that back to the ranch of origin. And we're also seeking out and continuing to research better ways to transfer that identification throughout our process, right? From the animal to the products, whether that's the meat products or the hides that we utilize in our tanneries. So ultimately, I think with time and research, finding that best solution, to your point, in large production is important. And with time and research, I think that can happen. But we need to make sure that it's a practical solution that's cost effective for our customers as well as for ourselves and our production.
Okay, thank you. A second question I have for you. In the leather industry, improved hide quality is becoming more essential for tanners and obviously for brands and retailers who sell their leather products to maximize their yield for each piece of leather. What work is Tyson engaged with at the moment that improves sort of overall hide quality? And can you see a future where hides in the US will no longer be subject to any sort of man-made damages, such as sort of hot iron branding?
Good question. Thank you. Our hide business partners are important to Tyson. Again, we're constantly looking for better ways to improve our process and ultimately the end product that we provide to our customers. Now, in regards to hot iron branding, there are still some states here that require branding by law for identification of the animals. However, we do work with our supply chain to find better ways to identify animals, whether that is through electronic identifiers, so EID button ear tags or visual ear tags, for example. And in addition to that, support the efforts of industry, such as the Beef Quality Assurance Program that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, thank you for that, Laura. There is a couple of questions here that I want to ask to Mike Costello of Stahl. Hi, Mike. I've got a question here for you. Do you feel that the leather industry has been misrepresented in the past in relation to its carbon footprint and its association with livestock such as cattle compared with other competing materials?
Yes, I think it's probably a better question, Martin, for Cotans or others that were really deeply involved in the Secretariat in this particular case in developing the product category rules several years ago, because I wasn't involved at that early stage. And I think they would probably be able to give you a better answer. I really don't have a good feeling for who was involved early on, because this started many years ago, as you know. The industry has been pushing for a zero allocation, as you know. And what we've ended up with is something a little bit more than that. But certainly the allocation isn't as high as some others were asking for. So I don't have a good feeling, honestly, as to how the industry views this allocation. But certainly it's something that will continue, of course, but it's still less than 1%. And I think most of the allocation are inputs and outputs that we can work on as an industry. As I discussed, I think there are many, many inputs and outputs that we as an industry have influence over. And I think that should be the focus of our efforts rather than spending too much time fighting about the allocation. Yeah, that's my own opinion.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Yeah, I think we can agree that the allocation that the leather industry has been given is probably a fair one. A second question for you to consider. How does a chemical supplier such as Stahl provide open and transparent information about what compounds are in its products while protecting its own commercial formulations and intellectual property? How do you get that balance?
Yeah, this has been a major change in the industry, hasn't it, over the last few years? Because I would say 5, 10, certainly even 5 years ago, divulging the kind of information about our products in the industry that we are would have been unheard of. And it's all in the spirit of transparency, because I think we all understand that this is the only way to go. It's also what our customers and on our brand customers at the end of the cycle are also asking for more transparency. It doesn't mean giving away all your formulas, by the way, because you can say what your products are containing without giving the formulas away, and you can easily be transparent on certain restricted substances. However, there are some situations where we sign formal agreements on this kind of transparency and declarations and really telling a lot about our chemistry. So when we have those kind of agreements with a third party or with one or two other partners, then we would be able to give much more information, almost complete information. But yeah, it's been a tricky balance, and it's something that we're still doing more and more of. But speaking from our own case, and I think many of the chemical companies are the same, transparency now is really part of our corporate strategy. It's not something that's separate anymore. It's not something given to the compliance department or the sustainability department. So this kind of transparency and promoting transparency is part of what we do now. It's part of our corporate strategy. That doesn't mean giving away our formulas, by the way. It means all kinds of other things also. But there is that part of it. And if you just look at ZDHC as an example, the kind of information that we're making public on the ZDHC portal is something that would not have been even dreamed of a few years ago. I think it's a good example of how the industry is really taking this seriously and becoming part of our normal day-to-day operations.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. I'm afraid that's all the questions we have time for today. All the presenters are happy to be contacted after the webinar today to answer further questions we have not covered. I will forward any questions on, and you can contact me on the email address shown on the screen. I would now like to wrap up the webinar as we are out of time. Firstly, I would like to thank our three presenters for taking the time to present today. We covered a lot of ground in a very short space of time. I would also like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, Stahl and Tyson Foods, and my ILM colleagues who are working behind the scenes to make the webinar as smooth as possible. We will send you all a short survey after the webinar, and you can tell us what you thought of it. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar will be available via a video recording, and ILM will be organising more free webinars later on in the year, so keep an eye on our website, internationalleathermaker.com. Finally, I would also like to thank you all for tuning in and listening to the webinar today. Thank you and goodbye.